It's funny with these videos, with the articles, sometimes it's too much and sometimes it's not enough. And I kind of wanted it to be like that, where you have these things where if it's relevant to what you're working on or something that you're interested in, you tune in. But if it's not something relevant, then you just skip a week or you just don't read at that time. So I actually find that that's pretty normal. So hopefully that works. And that's why we try to stick with just one topic, maybe two, where we can really focus for that moment. But if it's not something relevant, you don't have to waste your time to get to something that is. So kind of fun. And I just wanted to see, I think Mike will be joining us, but he had a 10:30 meeting, so he might be in just a minute late. So we'll just wait 30 more seconds. It is the summer, and we're starting, it's definitely different than it was just a month or two ago. But even the spring this year was a little quiet. So don't beat yourself up. There's a lot that's changing this year. We just have to be ready. And what I was telling a lender yesterday, I think, is it's, or maybe it was a realtor. We're not running away from this industry just because you have a slow month or a slow 6 months or a slow year. If this is what you define yourself as, then this is what you define yourself as. Don't be tempted by the ups and the downs and the MLS changes and the NER settlement. I think you really just, you focus on what you're good at and you just ride those waves, and that that's normal. But it's also helpful to be connected with your industry so that you can see if other people are going through the same thing or if it's just you. If you're on an island by yourself and you don't know if this is normal or not, that's a really tough existence. But if you do talk to people and know that that this is maybe more normal, I think that can get you through tougher times. So that's what I like to do. When I talk to realtors, I think the key for me is I tell people across the board, people were slower. It was palpable. But within that, there were moments where agents were super busy, or they might have gotten really lucky, or maybe we got really lucky. And you're not always the the example or the average for your entire industry. A lot of times you're a one-off. So when we were busy in March, a lot of people weren't, and I think that we just kind of got lucky. But then my June is a little quiet. And I know a lot of people's June is quiet, but there are certain people I'm competitors with that are not that way. So it balances. It absolutely balances. And one of the hardest things to do is to evaluate that balance. Where is it working? Where is it not? And that there's my transition. I'm sure someone will join this video at some point. But in the meantime, I will transition into what the topic I wanted to talk about. So in my email, in my invite, I wrote a fun little intro to maybe see if I could get you to hook. So when I was in college, my wife and I were dating, and we went out to a restaurant, and there were these beautiful girls that were in fancy clothes, and they were hard not to notice. And my wife actually said something. She said, the rule is you can't do a low cut blouse and a short skirt. You kind of have to pick one. I just thought that was so funny, but it makes a lot of sense where it's like, if you can't bend over or step up the stairs, yeah, that's probably not the best outfit to wear. And I think real estate, in the funniest way, is actually the exact same issue. And it's keep that in mind, because when you are working with price and terms, you really can't have both all the time. And when you're the person trying to give advice to your customer or you're trying to negotiate, keep that in mind, because if someone offers, let's say you're listed the house for 1.2 million and it's only been on the market for a couple of weeks, it's not like it's been a long time, and you have a buyer that comes in and offers $1 million. So now we're talking about a low ball. It sounds silly, but you're at least 20% below asking price, and the property's only been on the market for a couple of weeks. So that in my mind is a low ball. So you're lowballing on price, and the buyer's asking for a sale contingency. They want a financing contingency. They want a 15-day as is due diligence. They want da 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 da. They want all these things. They want a 180-day closing, and maybe seller financing. Who knows what this buyer's asking for? But it doesn't feel right. It's like you start looking at it and you're like, all right, let me look at step one, let's look at the price, and then we look at the sale contingency, and I don't like sale contingency. I've never done one of those. And then we look at the next thing. And really what you should do before that is you kind of separate price and terms, and you say, are they asking for both? In this case, I would say they're asking for both. Not ideal. You've got a buyer who wants the whole world. They want a low price, they want the best terms, they want no risk. They want all the upside, but no risk. And if you can get your client that, more power to you. That's incredible. In fact, in the COVID, craziness of this real estate market, you saw sellers kind of getting both. They were getting top dollar, and they were getting no contingency. So there's like zero risk on a seller. It was a win-win. That's pretty unusual. That only comes in the most extreme markets. An extreme buyer's market or an extreme seller's market, can you get both? But for all the rest of us, pick one. Don't wear the short skirt and the low blouse. Pick one. And so let's go through a couple of scenarios where I actually started with that. And then, then you kind of figure out how to evaluate a response. But if you don't start with that, you don't really know what you're dealing with. So that's the start. We did the first example, which was the $1 million, or it was a $1.2 million sale or list price, $1 million offer, sale contingency, so on and so forth. So in that example, you've got price and you've got terms. A buyer can't get both. We're not that bad of a market. At least not yet. So here's how I evaluated it. I said, what's more important to your seller? Is it the price or is it the terms? And it's actually not a simple question. Don't jump to that answer. Don't just start yelling, it's got to be price. You kind of want to think about that. In this particular situation, the seller is actually kind of bleeding cash. The seller is struggling. They've got 2 homes. They are, getting older, and they're really worried about how much money they have in the bank. And, the next quarterly assessment is coming up. The next insurance premium is coming up. The taxes will be here in November. So the seller's starting to feel the squeeze. So though price is very important, the terms might actually be more important. So I asked the listing agent, I asked the seller to look at that first and come up with your priority. And they said, well, the price is still a little low, but we're willing to negotiate. It's like, maybe we won't do $1 million, but let's counter at 1.1. So we put it 1.1. And then the sale contingency. I've actually heard this a lot recently. Sale contingencies are not something a lot of people know much about. They're somewhat rare, especially coming out of COVID. They're pretty tough. If you want to do a sale contingency, the first thing we have to do is understand it. And the NABOR sale contingency is a great example of it. I'm going to see if I can log in and get it. But basically it's saying that if the buyer doesn't sell their other property by a certain date, then they can, hey Mike, then they can ask for their deposit back. That's a contingency. Any contingency doesn't happen, buyer would get their deposit back. Mike, welcome.
Yeah, I had a Zoom that went a little long, so I apologize for coming in
You're
late.
fine. I told everybody that you didn't like us, so. So we're talking about price and terms, and Mike's heard that from me before. So let me share my screen so that you guys can see this. Let's see where it's called. Sale of existing property. You see that, Mike?
Yep.
All right, good. So this is the Namor version. Buyer's obligations under this contract are contingent upon, meaning if this thing didn't happen, you would get your deposit back. The closing of and disbursement on the sale of buyer's real property located at. So you'd put your buyer's other property in that line, which is presently under contract. That's a sticking point. We'll talk about that in a second. The second paragraph is such closing disbursement does not occur on or before a certain date, then either buyer or seller may terminate this contract. Seller's right to terminate this contract shall cease if prior to exercise of seller's right to terminate, seller receives notice that buyer has waived this contingency. Seller shall not be obligated to close on the sale fewer than 15 days after the date buyer gives notice of that satisfaction or waiver. So if you haven't used this form, the step one is read it. You know, there were a couple of things that I've gotten feedback on recently. Number one, you know, what do we do with that date? You know, what date do you put in there? And actually, that's a really tricky part of the negotiation. So we're going to hit that second. The other part is what I pointed out, this line, which is presently under contract. Mike, why do you think Nabor put that line that this sale of existing property, that existing property is currently under contract? Is that why did they put that language even in there? What if it's not?
Well, I mean, I guess right off the bat, what jumps out at me is peace of mind. I mean, the other side wants to know, well, wait a minute, I don't really like doing this, but make me feel better about it.
You know, Mike, you told me that you didn't like it when I just threw you to the wolves, and you handled it
again
very well again. That was beautiful. Yeah, it's just not entirely fair if the buyer's other property is not even listed. That's tough, right? But for, you know, the next step would be listing it and then being under contract. That's the holy grail, is that if you're going to do a sale contingency, you should expect that the buyer's property is under contract, because otherwise you're asking the seller to take quite the risk. And you would never get away with that in a seller's market. You really can only get away with it in a buyer's market, and maybe a buyer's market for this particular property. You know, if it's just been sitting there and it's just kind of unique, then maybe you get away with it without it being under contract. But that's kind of step one. Use the form to educate yourself and say, well, if this is somewhat the standard, why are we not even listed? Ugh. All right, so if this is a problem, if you have a seller, you tell the seller, hey, this isn't ideal. What you can do is you can actually just cross it out. Cross it out, have them initial it, have them sign it, and then you're fine. You know, if it's not under contract and the seller's willing to sign it, you're okay. That would be fine. But is it ideal? No, it's probably not ideal. You would rather the other property being under contract. You kind of want to know, how big of a contingency is this? The other thing, Mike, I mentioned this date. What is your guess as to what date you should put in there? Because you have your purchase contract and you have a closing date on your purchase. So it's, you know, I'm offering to you to buy your property, Mike, and I'm saying, hey, give me 90 days. I've got to sell my other property. So our closing date is 90 days from now. But what date do I put here for my contingency?
Well, that one I'm not sure about. Yeah, I'm still thinking back to that first paragraph. My biggest concern, and I'll get back to your question in a second. My biggest concern with the first paragraph would be, if I'm a seller, I'm trying to figure out whether this buyer is just trying to tie me up for an extended period, which might work against my interests.
Okay.
And finding it presently under contract does give me a little bit of a narrower focus on where it's going. But yeah, I remember a period where we had buyers putting offers in and getting them accepted on like 5 different properties. And all the guy was trying to do is tie up all 5, while maybe he could flip one, and just playing games like that, which we would tell our people, don't agree to that. This is what can happen, et cetera. But there were people in town that were doing that. But getting to the date in paragraph number 2, if such closing and disbursement does not occur on or before, the seller or buyer may terminate this contract. I guess in a broad answer would be, what date is the seller comfortable with? I mean, the seller has, he might not have disclosed why he wants it closed by a certain date. You don't know what's going on in the seller's world. So what date is he comfortable with is kind of what jumps out at me.
And you know what? That's probably not how most people evaluate it, but I love your answer. So I would say most people, they just match up that date with the closing date. They say, all right, 60 days from now, we're going to do a closing. And so my contingency date will be 60 days. I would say most people start with that, but I am in agreement with you. My typical advice is, what kind of contingency is the seller comfortable giving? Because let's do the 60-day, 90-day thing again. So you have a 60-day closing, but I really want to know how much of a closing we have. I want some leverage. I don't want to give all the leverage to the buyer to be able to pull the rug out last second. If you did 60 and 60, then you'd be under contract with that seller for at least 60 days. They do their inspections, they get their financing, they do all this stuff. In the meantime, they're working to get their other property sold, get it under contract, and they could hold you up until day 60 and then say, hey, it didn't happen. Day 61, they could terminate and the buyer would get their money back. Seller would get nothing. Except, there was a chance the seller would be able to sell, but it didn't work out that way. They don't get to keep the deposit. There's no benefit for them now being off the market for 2 months. So what I like to do is, if you're not under contract and you're not listed, I like to put a shorter date like what you recommended. I'll put 30 days. And it doesn't mean that the buyer's other property has to be sold in 30 days. It means that the seller regains some leverage. They regain a little bit of leverage to be able to terminate the deal. So we go through 30 days and the buyer's other property is not under contract, it's not sold, but it is listed. And so you look at it, your day 30, and you're like, I think they're going to sell that property. They're getting a lot of interest. Their listing agent is saying it's going really, really well. They've got 3 or 4 people interested. They're making offers. Like, I think it's going to go there, but they're not there yet. In that scenario, the seller might agree to do an extension of the contingency. They might say, hey, I'll give you another 15 days of the extension of the contingency. And that would be great. Alternatively, you could be looking at their listing and say, man, they haven't even got it listed, or the price is terrible, or I talked to the listing agent and it's completely dead. In that case, you don't want to be tied up for another 30 days. You want to be able to terminate as a seller. Now, if the seller terminates, they don't get to keep the deposit. The buyer might terminate as well, so that's a possibility. But it gives you some leverage. You didn't have to wait 60 days. You didn't have to drag this out for the whole season. And especially if this was season and you agreed to a sale contingency in February, and now the market's taking off and interest rates come down, you want to take some of that leverage back as a seller. So Mike, you and I, again, we didn't talk about that, but you nailed it. I would say your reasoning is more unique, but it is the way we should be thinking about it. You can see
You hit the
there.
nail on the head, Christian, with what you might do in the winter season, like February, March, might be quite different than what you might do in the fall. And maybe in the fall you haven't had any showings and not much is happening. So you're willing to, in effect, give them a little more slack.
Yeah.
Because you don't really have a lot coming, but you have that anticipation at the height of our winter season that I don't want to tie this up for a long term because I think someone else could probably come along.
It's true. And it's not just season, it could be any factor that's kind of, stymieing your listing. We've got a lot of inventory right now. It's June. You know, the condos are kind of giving us some problems, some headaches. And so if you agreed to do some sort of sale contingency, maybe that's okay. Maybe you didn't have a ton of other options. Maybe the seller is more, they're willing to give it a shot and hope. Here's to the other side. If we give the buyer a sale contingency, even knowing we're not going to get any money from it, if the buyer walks, maybe the buyer gets emotionally invested. Maybe the real estate agent gets emotionally invested and is, you know, hoping that this deal closes. And as opposed to saying, hey, when you get listed, when you go under contract, call us. You know, maybe I can tie them in so they stop looking elsewhere. There are benefits to a seller agreeing to this, but you don't want to give up all your leverage, and you want to be able to evaluate your market, because Mike, you and I have heard over and over again where a seller is upset because they think their listing agent gave them bad advice. You know, oh, I can't believe she told us to take the lower price cash offer. You know, I should have taken the top dollar, even if it was a mortgage, they would have been fine. It's tough. We have to educate, empower the client to decide. And if then they ask for our opinion, then we can give it. But you want to maintain leverage. If your client says, oh my gosh, I can't believe we agreed to a 90-day closing, say, well, remember, at day 30, we can always pull the offer. You know, that would be okay. So I love it, Mike. Thank you again. You delivered. This last line, Christina asked, seller shall not be obligated to close on the sale of property fewer than 15 days after the date buyer gives notice of seller of satisfaction or waiver of this contingency. So two things on this. Number one, I don't think I've ever had a buyer or seller try to extend the closing based on this. I've never seen it. Not that they can't, but typically if you had a 60-day closing and a 60-day contingency, as soon as that contingency goes, we close. You know, the buyer's excited, they want to close. The seller's excited, they're hopeful that it's going to work out. I've never seen a buyer or a seller, I guess in this case, the seller try to extend closing another 15 days, but that's a potential problem. Imagine the scenario where you do 60 days and 60 days, the seller decides, I'm not moving out. I'm not going to spend money on movers. I'm not going to take all my stuff out, yada, 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 until I know the contingency is over with. So in that scenario, you go to the 60-day contingency, they sell their house, the buyer waives their contingency at that point, right? It's happened. Well, now the seller can extend the closing because, you know, they didn't know if it was going to happen or not. So your 60-day closing technically turned into a 75-day closing. So that's why they do it. They're trying to protect the seller from a last second, hey, you need to get out. That being said, I've never seen it. I haven't seen them actually use it. They could. I think it's actually a pretty valuable tool, but I haven't seen it yet. Christina also asked a good question. Will rules ever change as to not being able to keep advertising for a seller for backup offers, aka staying active on MLS when things like this happen? So this is actually a really good point. I'm really glad that you brought this up, Christina, because if you accept an offer, you have to mark it as pending. And you might even have to mark it pending with contingencies. So that is your obligation under the current MLS rules. If you accept the offer, you need to mark it as pending with contingencies. There isn't a way to break that rule. I think it's what, 3 days, Mike? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people that say, well, until the contingency's removed or satisfied, I'm gonna leave it active. Well, that's how you get in trouble very quickly.
It's how you get in trouble with MLS. And
Yep.
I've even seen where the buyer and seller will put in the contract, seller may continue to market the property as active, right? So the buyer has agreed that this is allowed. Guess what? It's not up to the buyer. It doesn't work that way. The listing agent has an obligation per MLS rules to do it a certain way. Nick Bobzien and I did an entire video on MLS rules and this particular topic. I think we posted that last year, maybe a little more than a year ago. It's a really great video if you haven't seen it, but the title of it is Manipulating MLS. And because that's exactly what you're trying to do, but doesn't really work that way. That's where, you know, another broker, another real estate agent could turn you into MLS. Let's see if I can find this. So
Yeah,
another
by the-
shameless plug, Mike. This is we post all our videos on YouTube.
there
So
you
if
go.
you haven't seen something, go ahead and jump on here.
One thing I want to point out, Christian, is the fines now are much more stiff than they were in the old days. So there are fines that will get your attention. It's just,
Well, and they can kick you out of the MLS. You know, you'd have to switch to a different MLS. You could get fines. You could potentially lose your license if it really is a violation of your license as well. So there, you can still accept backup offers, but the realities of this are that your seller needs to know that if you accept the offer, you're going to get a lot less interest from the market because it's going to show as pending. That's one of the downsides. You can do what they call kick-out clauses, where it's, you're kind of playing with the terms. Kick-out clause, you're taking back a little bit more leverage and saying, if I get another offer and the buyer doesn't waive their contingency, then I can terminate the deal. I would say the easier way is just to have a shorter contingency date. The other trick, Mike, is this would be if you had a normal deposit. Let's say you had a buyer putting down 10%. They want to protect their deposit. But what if they only put 1% down? So in my scenario, it's $1 million purchase. And what if they only put 10 grand? And not that 10 grand is nothing, but in our market, we would normally see a $100,000 deposit. So instead of the $100,000 deposit with a sale contingency, I look at no sale contingency, but only a $10,000 deposit. And the reason I would do that is the buyer is going to lose their 10 grand if they don't close. And the seller will get that as, some sort of offset. It's almost like that's their fee for taking it off the market for 2 months. Very reasonable, but you have to change your mindset and see is that an option. So you just have to be creative. You have to be flexible. Where's the pressure point? You know what the other option is, Mike?
what?
Wait for another buyer. You and I were talking earlier about, that push-pull and the price versus terms. If the buyer is asking for the whole world, that may not be your buyer. If you say, well, why don't we take the deposit down and no contingency? Or what if we have a shorter contingency and a big deposit? And, you got to get that price up. And if the buyer just keeps saying, nope, take it or leave it, sometimes you have to leave it. Sometimes you just have to say, no, thank you.
Let me ask you this question. I'm going to throw a question at you.
All right, bring it.
We all know price is a very important factor. In your years of doing this, what are the important terms that jump out at you that seem to be hot buttons?
Well, let's start with, maybe I should even go to the board. We should start with the material terms in a legal sense. So what does the court determine is required for a valid contract? So that's probably where I'd start. And you mentioned the big one, which is price. Material terms that also make a contract: price, closing date, the parties. You got to identify the property, and that kind of might be it. Who's going to do the closing is something that came up recently in a lawsuit. But they're like 4 things: price, closing date, the parties have to agree to it, and then we have to identify the property. Those are the big terms. But that's terms of the contract, but terms in regarding the negotiation, which is really where your question went. I think the deposit matters. The contingencies matter. If you're obligated to do something, your rights and your responsibilities. So as a seller, I've got to look at what can they make me do versus what do I have the option to do? That matters. So if we take an example, buyer makes an offer on a NABOR standard contract. The nice thing of that is that the buyer cannot make the seller do repairs. There's no obligation unless the seller agrees to it. But in a FAR/BAR contract standard, the seller is obligated to do repairs. Whether they agree to it or not, that's how the FAR/BAR contract works. If they find defects, the seller has to fix them. That matters to me. What if I move to Chicago and I'm not here? What if it's a 2-week closing and there's no way I can get it done? You know, what you're gonna make me do it's essentially, you know, time and money and resources. It all kind of melds together. It's got a balance. Anything you were thinking, Mike?
Well, you know, a term that was very important when inventory was tight was post-closing occupancy, because what was happening was the seller needed some time to find another place to go to, because a lot of the rental inventory was very low, so that option was kind of off the table. And then, yeah, there wasn't a lot of inventory to pick from if they wanted to still stay in the area. Since inventory has climbed, I've seen less of that. The sellers wanting to stay over for a period of time.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. And I think a lot of times we got caught asking for post-closing occupancy, even if we didn't need it. It was almost like one of those things where the buyers were competing so hard that they were like, well, we'll give you 100,000 over asking, and we'll close in 10 days, and we'll let you stay there for a month. And the seller's like, well, okay. You know, it's not like they needed it, but it was something that the buyer could offer in addition to just price. It was like a kicker. A
It
lot of
probably saved
times
a lot of marriages.
it may have, yeah. But I'm not a fan of post-closing occupancies. I think that you should be able to, you know, work out a deal where that doesn't have to happen, because there's so many downsides. You know, if we look at it selfishly, we've already all gotten paid because the closing happened. And now for the next 10 days or month or however long post-closing is, we have to deal with it as like, we're almost like landlords and tenants, and we didn't choose to be. I don't like them because it makes more work for us. There are more problems that'll come up. And very rarely does it go perfectly. There's always something. You know, they complain that the stove broke, and the seller's like, well, it was broken before. It's like, oh my God. I've got right now, we had a $3,000 security deposit, and I think the seller stayed in the house for 2 weeks. And when the buyer took possession, they realized the stove was broken. And it's probably, I don't know, it's an induction oven. It's going to cost at least $1,000, if not more. And the seller's like, well, it was broken before. How, you know, I don't think so, but maybe. I don't know. It's really, really not fun. Pre-closing occupancy is different. You know, interestingly, you know, post-closing occupancy is almost more normal than pre-closing occupancy. And I kind of want to change that. I think if you can give the buyer some sort of kicker, and actually get a benefit from it, you may want to really seriously consider it. A lot of times you'll have a buyer that says, well, we just want to be able to move stuff into the garage or put our furniture in or whatever, you know, we have stuff being delivered, and say, sure, you can put everything in the garage, just sign this pre-closing occupancy. And the cool thing about it is it actually protects the seller, because it waives that, you know, the buyer doesn't have the option to change anything. They indemnify the seller, and the seller's maintenance obligation stops right then and there. So it's kind of cool. But a lot of attorneys freak out about it. Even my dad, you know, historically never liked pre-closing occupancy. And his argument was, well, you know, if you let the buyers, you know, move in and they hear some weird stuff, or they notice something wrong, maybe they won't close. Well, if they're already moved in, I'm pretty sure they're going to close. And this
Never know, though.
contractually, the seller doesn't have a maintenance obligation anymore.
I agree with your dad. I mean, it makes me nervous. I mean, yeah, maybe the neighbor comes over and says, by the way, did they ever fix that leak in the roof? You know, you're the buyer and you're saying, what leak? There's nothing on the seller's disclosure statement.
So here's what
Worry
I
about the
would.
what ifs.
No, you're right, Mike. The problem, I suppose, is that no one reads these things the way attorneys do. So they're gonna move in and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize there was a leak under the sink. Well, look at this language here. Look at what I highlighted. Let's see if I can, it's right here. Buyer will complete desired inspections provided for in the contract prior to occupancy. Upon taking occupancy of the property, buyer accepts property in as-is condition and waives any of all buyer's remaining contractual contingencies and all remedial action obligations of seller and credit in lieu thereof, except those agreed by seller in writing prior to buyer's occupancy. So what that means is, under normal circumstances, if you go to the walkthrough and you find that the sink is leaking and it wasn't initially, well, that's the seller's obligation. They have the obligation to maintain the property. If it wasn't leaking before, then it shouldn't be leaking at the walkthrough at closing. But what this does is it says, well, if you didn't find it before, and then you take occupancy, well, now that maintenance obligation is on the buyer. The seller, you can't go to the seller contractually and make them fix the sink after the fact. So that's a huge win, especially if the property is empty, if the buyer's only taking occupancy with the garage or furniture. I don't know, it could go both ways. Interestingly, it just doesn't happen enough for me to give you a ton of examples. I did have one where the seller allowed the buyer to move their stuff into the property. So they had furniture. It was like, and it was expensive. It was $30,000 worth of furniture. And then the buyer started having problems with insurance and with their loan, and it was delaying closing. And the seller's like, well, buyer doesn't close, I'm going to get all their furniture. And it was a little messy, but the seller had no real concerns. They knew it was going to happen because the buyer had a lot to lose. Now, the contract that was a unique situation. Our contract basically gives the buyer the opportunity to remove personal property or to move out if the contract were to terminate. But realistically, the buyer doesn't want that expense. They don't want to have to move out. They want to close. That's the whole point. So you're not wrong, Mike. It's just a different perspective.
I agree.
So that's price versus terms. I thought that was pretty fun. There are other examples. We had one, and I've gone through some of these before. Whenever you get a deal that's got a lot of moving parts and you just don't know how to think about it, you really need to first dial it down to price and terms and look at price first, maybe, or see what the priority is. The house that I bought from my seller, this is actually a good example, so we'll use this. It was not on market. This was 2021. It wasn't listed, but the neighbor knew that they had tried to sell it previously. I'd actually found an expired listing. And so when we reached out, they were excited, but they were nervous. And so they said, well, we'll accept your price, but here are weird terms. So, and actually, I think they negotiated very slightly on price. I offered super low and they said, well, do this. And it was still low, so we did it. But their terms were very weird. The first term was, I think they gave us a 60-day as-is inspection period. 60 days, 60. So for 60 days, I could have terminated if I found something better. But the reason they wanted it was because they weren't going to let me do the inspection until day 60. So they wanted to be able to come to the house, clean it up, fix this, tinker with that, and they didn't want to be rushed. So they said, we'll do 60 days, but we're not allowing you on the property until the end. I'm like, okay, it's a little nerve-wracking. I'd like to know sooner rather than later, but okay. And then the closing was set for 6 months after that. So that was a weird term. I have a young family. We were wanting to move in, but it was okay. We had other plans, we had things that we could do, and this was a huge win for the seller. I don't think many other people would have given them basically 8 months to close. They would have, someone would have messed that deal up somewhere. So in that scenario, I got my price. That was most important to me, and the seller got their terms, and that was most important to them. It was actually a win-win. But if I had been belligerent and said like, I'll take that low price, but I'm not, I need to close in 30 days, that deal never would have happened. We would have been on a different planet in that sense. So that's why Mike will sell me his house for nothing.
You have to speak to my wife about that.
Oh, right, sorry. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone. I hope that was helpful. If you want to talk or have a closing you'd like to do with us, feel free to give me a call.
Good
Thank
session.
you, everybody.